You charge him rent, Wendy? He's family. What Bruce didn't read before the next board meeting. Picture the break room at Cascade Health Partners on a Thursday in March. Fluorescent light buzzing over the same coffee machine that had eaten my quarters for 6 years, and me holding a printout I was never supposed to see. Bruce Halverson stood by the microwave, stirring his tea with a wooden stick because he'd read some article about microplastics, and when I asked him, quietly, why the new hire Derek was making $142,000 for the exact triage protocol I had written and taught, Bruce didn't even lower his voice. Because Derek negotiates like a man who knows his worth, he said, and you, Wendy, you take what you're grateful for. He smiled the way you smile at a slow child. The stir stick clicked against the ceramic twice. That was the sound I remembered later, over everything else. 2 small clicks, and the word grateful. I was 51 years old and 11 weeks a widow, and I let him think that had broken something in me. It hadn't. It had done the opposite of that, though Bruce would need most of a year to learn it, and he would learn it in a room he chose, over a menu he chose, with his own mother's name coming out of my mouth. He believed he was mentoring a grateful woman. He had no working idea what my late husband and I had spent 11 years quietly assembling, or whose signature was on the paper that decided where his mother slept. Let me walk you back to where the real story starts, because the break room was only the place it surfaced. I grew up in Kent, Washington, the older of 2 girls, in a rambler off Military Road with aluminum siding the color of oatmeal, and a father who drove a delivery route for a bakery supply company for 29 years. We were not poor, and we were not comfortable. We were the specific kind of careful where my mother wrote the electric bill amount on the calendar square so she could watch it coming. I learned to count that way, watching squares on a calendar. I put myself through the nursing program at Highline College while working nights at a memory care facility in Federal Way, changing sheets for people who called me by their daughters' names. And I finished my nurse practitioner degree at Seattle University in 2009, 3 years married, 34 years old, exhausted in a way that felt like accomplishment. My husband was Marcus Brennan, a structural estimator for a mid-sized contractor, a patient man who did the household math with a mechanical pencil and a legal pad because he didn't trust spreadsheets to show him his own thinking. We were not flashy people. We drove a Honda past 200,000 miles on purpose. But Marcus had a conviction that most people spend their whole lives standing on ground they don't own, and he wanted us to own ground. So we did the unglamorous thing. In 2011, we bought a small 2-bedroom condo in Renton for $189,000, rented it out, and used the cash flow to feed the next one. By 2019, we held 4 units across Renton and Tukwila and a modest duplex in Burien, all of it in a limited liability company Marcus named Kestrel Holdings, after the little falcons that hunted the field behind his childhood house. We told almost no one. Not because we were hiding, but because Marcus said the moment people know your business, they start to have opinions about what you owe them. He was right about that. He was right about most things. And then in January, he was dead of a heart attack on the stairs of a job site in Auburn, 48 years old. And I learned that being right does not keep you. I met Bruce Halverson in 2016 when Cascade Health Partners hired me into their occupational and urgent care division out in the South Center corridor. Bruce was the clinical director then, 54, silver at the temples, the sort of man who wore a fleece vest over a dress shirt and remembered the name of your dog. In those first years, I want to be honest, he was good to me. He put me on the committee that redesigned our intake flow. He backed me when a physician twice my seniority tried to blame a bad outcome on my charting, and Bruce pulled the timestamps and made the man apologize in front of the medical director. He told me once, over a plastic clamshell of teriyaki from the place near the freeway, that I had the best clinical judgment in the building and the worst instinct for taking credit, and that he'd fix the second one. I believed he meant to. For a while, I think he did. I trained the newcomers. That was understood as mine. When we opened the second clinic in 2018, I wrote the triage protocol that got adopted across all 4 sites. The 12-page algorithm that decided in 90 seconds whether the man clutching his arm went to a chair or an ambulance. And I trained every provider who touched it. I was paid $96,000 a year to do it, and I thought that was a fair number because Bruce told me it was a fair number, and I had spent my whole life being told what was fair by people who benefited from my believing them. The erosion did not announce itself. That's the part nobody warns you about. It came in notes so small that flagging any one of them would have made me the problem. The first was a Tuesday in the fall of 2021 in a leadership meeting where I presented the outcomes data from my triage redesign. A 19% drop in missed triage. Hard numbers, my slides. Bruce sat at the head of the table, nodded along, and when the regional VP asked who had led it, Bruce said, "We built that as a team, and I'm proud of where my group landed it." My group. I told myself he meant it generously. I sat with my hands flat on the cool laminate, and I let it go, because it was one word, and I was tired, and Marcus had a fever at home. The second was the parking. We had a small covered lot, and the covered spots went, by unspoken custom, to the longest tenured providers. When a spot opened in early 2022, it went to a physician who'd been there 18 months, and when I mentioned it lightly to Bruce, he laughed and said covered parking was a young man's fight, and I was above it. I was above it. I was always above the things that would have cost him something to give me. The third I remember exactly, because it was the last one I mistook for a misunderstanding. In the summer of 2022, we needed a new lead for the second clinic's intake team, a role I had effectively been performing without the title for 2 years. I asked Bruce directly. He steepled his fingers the way he did, and he told me the org wanted a fresh face at the front of the room, and that leadership was about presence, and that he saw me as the spine of the operation, not the face of it. Then he gave the title to a 31-year-old named Whitney Sato, who had transferred in from the Bellevue site 9 months earlier, whom I had personally onboarded, whose first 3 months of competency I had signed off on with my own name. Whitney was not a villain. Whitney sent me a gift card to a spa and a note that said she couldn't have done it without me, and she meant it. And that somehow made it worse, because it meant everyone could see the shape of what I'd built, except the man deciding what I was worth. I want to be fair to my own memory. There were good days in that stretch, too. There was the winter morning a man came in gray and sweating, and my 90-second algorithm caught a widowmaker that a rushed provider would have sent home, and the cardiac team out at Valley told me later he'd have died in his truck in the lot. There was the potluck, where Bruce's wife Diane brought a lefse she'd learned from Bruce's Norwegian mother, thin and buttered and sugared, and she pressed a second one into my hands wrapped in a paper towel for Marcus, and I drove home genuinely warmed by these people. That is the thing about a slow betrayal. It braids itself through real kindness so that pulling it out feels like ingratitude. And grateful, remember, was the word he'd end on. Marcus died on the 9th of January. I took 2 weeks, which everyone agreed was reasonable and no one thought was enough. Bruce came to the memorial at the Lutheran Church in Kent, and he hugged me, and his eyes were wet, and I do not think he was faking that. And this is the hardest thing I will tell you. I think Bruce genuinely mourned my husband while remaining completely incapable of imagining that I might be worth more than he paid me. Grief and contempt lived in him at the same address. He sent a fruit arrangement. He told me to take all the time I needed. And then, 6 weeks after I buried Marcus, he hired Derek Voss. Derek was 34, personable, a decent clinician with an MBA he mentioned in the first 10 minutes, and Bruce assigned me to train him on the triage protocol. My protocol, the way I trained everyone. I did it. I did it well, because doing it badly would have been a betrayal of the patients, not of Derek. For 5 weeks I sat beside him and taught him the 90-second algorithm I had bled to build, And he was quick, I'll give him that, and grateful in the easy way of a man who has never once had to be. I found the number by accident, the way you always find the number that changes your life. A budgeting spreadsheet had been shared to the whole clinical leadership group by mistake. An administrative coordinator named Paula fat-fingered a permission, and it sat in my inbox for 4 minutes before IT clawed it back. And in those 4 minutes, I saw the provider compensation column. Derek Voss, $142,000. For the role I trained him into, $46,000 a year more than the woman who wrote the thing he was being paid to run. I printed it before it vanished. That was the printout in my hand in the break room over the buzzing coffee machine when I asked Bruce the quiet question, and he told me that Derek knew his worth, and I took what I was grateful for and stirred his tea, click, click, and walked out with his mug. I did not scream. I want to be precise about what happened inside me instead, because it was not nothing, and it was not a movie. It was a settling. It was the feeling of a number finally reconciling on a page after months of not balancing. A small internal click, like Bruce's stir stick, but mine. I drove home to the house in Kent that Marcus and I had paid off in 2020, and I sat at Marcus's desk with his legal pad still in the drawer, his mechanical pencil in the cup, and I did not cry. I opened the bottom drawer, the locked one, and I took out the folder, and I called Janet. Janet Okafor had been our attorney since 2013, a real estate and estate lawyer with a practice in Tukwila and a voice like a low cello. 62 years old, who had drafted every document Kestrel Holdings ever signed and who had loved Marcus and cried harder than I did at the church. When she picked up, I said, "Janet, I need to understand exactly what I own and exactly what it can do." And there was a pause, and she said, "About time, Wendy. Come Saturday. Bring the whole box." Here is the part I had known and not let myself know. The card I'd been holding face down for years. Back in 2017, before any of this, Bruce had come to Marcus and me at a summer barbecue in our own backyard with a problem. His mother, Solveig Halverson, then 79, was being pushed out of her longtime apartment in a building near Green Lake that was converting to condos. And Bruce, cash-strapped from a divorce settlement I hadn't known about and 2 kids in private college, could not carry a Seattle mortgage on top of it. Marcus, who could not stand to watch an old woman lose her footing, made him an offer over a paper plate of ribs. Kestrel Holdings would buy a suitable unit, and Solveig would live in it, and Bruce would pay only the property taxes and the HOA. No rent, no mortgage. A handshake dressed up properly because Marcus never left anything on a handshake. We bought a 1-bedroom in a well-kept building in the Maple Leaf neighborhood for $318,000. Solveig moved in that October and hung her lace curtains and her painting of the Norwegian coast. And she had lived there rent-free ever since, for going on 7 years, in a home that Bruce had come, somewhere along the way, to think of as good as his mother's own. He told people that. I heard it more than once at company gatherings, Bruce saying his mother had her place near Green Lake, folding it into the story of his own providence, and eventually saying that when she passed, the plan was for the unit to come to him, that it was, in effect, part of what he'd leave his kids, his inheritance. He said the word inheritance at a holiday party in 2022 with a glass of Rioja in his hand about a condo he did not own, had never owned, whose deed sat in a limited liability company controlled entirely, since Marcus's death, by the grateful woman he paid $96,000 a year. Because that is the plain fact, and I'll say it as plainly as a listener needs to hear it. I owned the flat Bruce's mother lived in. Not a share of it, all of it. Kestrel Holdings LLC held the title free and clear. We'd paid it off in 2021. And Marcus's will and our operating agreement left the whole company to me. There was no rent to raise and nothing to seize. Because Bruce had never had a thing to lose there, except the story he told about himself. And stories, it turns out, are the most expensive thing a proud man owns. Saturday, Janet spread it all across her conference table in Tukwila. The deed, the operating agreement, the will, the property tax receipts going back to 2017, the emails where Bruce confirmed the arrangement in his own words. You could serve his mother a lease and a market rate rent tomorrow, Janet said, tapping the deed. $2,100 a month in that building? Easy. You could ask them to buy it at appraisal. Call it $490 now. You could sell it out from under the arrangement with proper notice. She looked at me over her reading glasses. But I don't think that's you, and I don't think it's Marcus. So tell me what you actually want, and we'll build the shape that gets you there without you ever raising your voice. I told her. It took me a while to say it because it was not about the condo, and it was never about the condo. What I wanted was for Bruce to understand, exactly once and past all deniability, that the woman he called grateful had been quietly holding the roof over his mother's head the entire time he was underpaying her. That the arithmetic of his own life had been sitting in my hands, and that I had chosen, out of decency and not weakness, never to use it. I wanted him to feel the specific vertigo of realizing that the person you diminished was the person keeping you whole. And I wanted it done cleanly, on paper, without a single thing he could report to HR or spin into me being unstable, the widow who cracked. So we built the shape, and it took a season, and here is what patience looks like when it has a plan. First, I had Janet draft a deed of trust, a formal recorded document naming Kestrel Holdings as the owner and beneficiary, with a written residency agreement attached, spelling out in plain language the terms under which Solveig Halvorsen occupied the unit. At the pleasure of the owner, no cost, terminable on 90 days' notice, no interest of any kind conveyed to any heir. It simply put on recorded paper what had always been true. Janet recorded it with King County in April. It cost me a notary fee and $32 in recording charges to make the truth official. Second, and this is the part I'm least proud of and most glad I did, I went to see Solveig myself. She was 86 now, sharp as a tack, and she made me coffee in a percolator that took 11 minutes and served it with a plate of the same buttered lefse Diane had once pressed on me, because it was Solveig's recipe all along. I told her the truth, all of it, gently, that Marcus and I had bought her home, that I owned it now, that nothing about her living there was changing, not one thing, and that I only wanted her to hear it from me and not from a document. She was quiet a long moment, stirring her coffee, and then she said, I always wondered why Bruce never had the papers. When I asked to see the deed, he said it was complicated. She set down her spoon. My son tells a story about himself, dear. He always has. His father was the same. Charming men who mistake being liked for being good. She reached over and put her dry hand on mine. You've been a better landlord than he's been a son. Now what has he done to you? I told her that, too. And Solveig Halvorsen, 86 years old, listened to the whole thing about the salaries and the training and the word grateful. And when I finished, she folded her napkin into a neat square and said, By the next board meeting, I think, I would like to be at dinner. I hadn't planned to bring her, but I'd learned enough by then to know that some blows land cleanest when they come from the one person a man can't dismiss. Third, I let the season turn, and I did my job impeccably, and I said nothing. I trained the next hire. I signed my charts. I let Bruce believe I had swallowed the break room and moved on, because a proud man reads silence as surrender, and I wanted him relaxed. There is a physical thing Bruce did when he felt in command that I had watched for 6 years without understanding what it meant. He would tuck his thumb into his fist and rub it slowly with the side of his index finger, a small, self-soothing gesture, like a man reassuring himself he still held the coin. I saw it constantly that spring, in every meeting where he thought he'd put me back in my grateful place. I let him rub the coin. I knew something he didn't, which was that there wasn't one. The company scheduled its spring leadership dinner for the third week of May, the annual one before the June board meeting, at Il Terrazzo Carmene's sister spot out in the suburbs east of the lake, a genuinely upscale Italian place in the Bellevue direction, with white cloths, a sommelier, veal on the menu, and prices that made the administrative staff order carefully. Bruce loved that dinner. He held court at it. It was, I understood, exactly the room he would want to be standing in when he felt tallest, which is why I asked Janet to have everything ready for the week before, and why I called the restaurant myself and reserved the private alcove in my own name and paid the deposit, $400, so that I would be, quietly, the host. Bruce didn't notice that. He wouldn't have imagined it. The night of, I wore the navy dress I'd bought for Marcus's brother's wedding and hadn't worn since the funeral. And I brought a slim leather folio that had been Marcus's, and inside it, the recorded deed of trust and the residency agreement, and a single printed page. Solveig came in a taxi I'd arranged, in a wool coat the color of cranberries and her mother's cameo brooch. And I met her at the door, and Bruce did not see her come in because he was at the bar, telling the regional VPA story with a glass of Barolo in his hand and his thumb tucked into his fist. We were 14 at the long table in the alcove. Whitney was there, and Derek, and Paula, who'd sent the fatal spreadsheet, and the VP, and Diane, and the medical director. I seated Solveig at the far end by the window, quietly, and for the first half of the dinner, nothing happened at all. That was deliberate. I wanted the evening ordinary. I wanted Bruce loose and expansive and 3/4 through his second glass, and I got him there. And around the time the plates were cleared, he did the thing I'd been waiting for. He stood, tapped his glass, and gave a little toast about the year, about the team, about how leadership was really about the people you lift. And then, I swear I did not script this, he handed it to me. He looked down the table and said, "And to Wendy, our steady hand, the one who keeps us all grateful for what we've got." There was that word again, offered to me a second time, in front of everyone, as a compliment. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I have never once, in this whole story, raised my voice, and I wasn't going to start in a room with white tablecloths. "Thank you, Bruce," I said. "Since you've raised gratitude, I want to say something true, because you all know I trained most of the room and I don't have a talent for taking credit. Bruce told me that himself years ago, and he was right." A few soft laughs. Bruce smiled, magnanimous, thumb in his fist. "So let me practice. There's a home in the Maple Leaf neighborhood, a one-bedroom near Green Lake, where a lovely woman has lived rent-free for going on 7 years. Bruce has spoken warmly about it, about how it'll pass to his family one day. I've heard him call it part of his inheritance." I opened Marcus's folio. "I wanted, tonight, to make sure the record is clear, because Bruce believes in knowing your worth, and worth begins with knowing what you actually hold." I laid the deed of trust on the white cloth and slid it, unhurried, to the center of the table. "My late husband and I bought that home in 2017, I said. "We paid it off in 2021. It has never belonged to anyone but our company, which belongs, since Marcus died, entirely to me. There is no rent to raise. There is no inheritance to pass. There is a deed recorded with King County last month and a residency agreement, and the name on both of them is mine." I let that sit for exactly one breath. "I've charged nothing for 7 years, and I intend to charge nothing for 7 more, because that was Marcus's promise, and it's mine. I'm not telling you this to take anything. I'm telling you because a man who pays a woman $96,000 to train the man he pays $142 and calls her grateful for it should at least know whose roof his mother sleeps under." Bruce did not go pale. I'd been told these men go pale, and he didn't. What happened to Bruce Halverson was smaller and worse. His mouth kept its shape, but his eyes went flat and rapid, moving from the deed to my face to the deed, and his right thumb dug into his fist so hard the knuckle whitened, rubbing, the coin that wasn't there, and he said, in the reasonable voice he used for shutting things down, "This is not the venue, Wendy. My mother's living situation is a private family matter, and frankly, this is inappropriate to—" "You're right," said Solveig Halvorsen from the far end of the table by the window. I don't think anyone had noticed her. She set down her water glass, and the whole table turned toward the small woman in the cranberry coat. And Bruce's face finally did the thing, the real thing, not paling, but a kind of collapse, the way a tent collapses when one pole goes. Because there is no toast, no HR complaint, no reasonable voice on earth that a 59-year-old man can deploy against his own 86-year-old mother. "It is a private family matter," Solveig said, and her voice was thin, but it carried, the accent still in it after 60 years. "So I will speak, since I am the family." She turned her cameo brooch a quarter turn with 2 fingers, the way I'd seen her do at her kitchen table. "Bruce, you have told people for years that you gave me that home. You did not give me that home. Marcus Brennan gave me that home, and this woman has kept it for me since he died, and neither of them ever once let me feel it as charity, which is more than I can say for the way you let me feel your money when you sent it." She folded her napkin into that neat square. "I asked you 3 times to show me the deed. 3 times you told me it was complicated. It was not complicated. It was hers. You lied to your mother about a piece of paper so you could feel like a big man, and now you have underpaid the very person who was covering for your lie and called her grateful. I did not raise you to be a small man, Bruce, but you have worked very hard at it, and tonight I am ashamed at this beautiful table in front of these good people, and I wanted you to hear it from the one person you cannot call unstable. I have never heard a room hold so still around such quiet words." Diane was crying without sound. The VP was studying the tablecloth. Bruce sat down. He actually sat down, slowly, and his thumb came out of his fist and lay flat on the cloth. And he had nothing. No reasonable voice, no toast, no story about himself that would fit through the door his mother had just closed. He looked, for the first time in the years I'd known him, like a man who did not know what he was worth, because someone had finally shown him the number, and it was not the one he'd told everyone. That was the whole reckoning. There was no shouting, and no security escort, and no cinematic exit. I put the deed back in Marcus's folio, and I thanked everyone for coming, and I told the table quietly that I'd handled the check, that it was my treat, that I'd hosted, and I saw the small understanding move across the VP's face that I had, in fact, hosted, that the dinner Bruce held court at had been the widow's the entire time. I walked Solveig out to her taxi and buttoned her cranberry coat against the cool, and she patted my cheek and said, "Come Sunday, I'll make the good coffee." And I drove home to Kent alone, and I did cry then, a little, on Interstate 5 in the dark, but not for Bruce, for Marcus, who bought an old woman a home over a plate of ribs and never told a soul, and who would have hated the whole scene and been secretly, fiercely glad. The balance simply righted itself after that, without fireworks, the way water finds its level. I did not get Bruce fired. I didn't have to, and it wasn't mine to do. But the spreadsheet was real, and now the VP had seen its author's character over veal, and by the June board meeting, the compensation review that had been not a priority became one. My salary was corrected to $138,000 with 11 months of back pay, and a formal apology I framed and hung in the downstairs bathroom where I could enjoy it privately. Whitney, who turned out to have a spine after all, put the intake-led title in writing as a shared role and insisted my name go on the protocol in the system so that every new hire now trains on the Brennan triage algorithm, which is a small immortality I did not ask for and will keep. Bruce took an early retirement package in the fall, his choice, dressed as his choice, the way everything with him was, and he moved to Arizona. And I hear he tells a story about how he decided it was time to slow down. Solveig still lives in the flat near Green Lake, rent-free, and always will. I own it. Nothing changed except that now, once a month, I drive up on a Sunday and she makes coffee in the 11-minute percolator and teaches me to make the lefse right. You have to get the potato dough thin enough to read a newspaper through, she says. And I never can. But she's patient. More patient with me than her son ever was. This past Sunday, she showed me how to work the grooved rolling pin she brought from Norway in 1961. And we made a dozen, and I burned 2. And she wrapped the good 10 in a clean dish towel and pressed them into my hands at the door the way Diane once did with hers, and told me to eat them at my own table. So that's where I'll leave it. Last night, I stood in the kitchen in Kent, in the house Marcus and I paid off, and I unwrapped that towel, and I ate a piece of an old woman's lefse standing over the sink at 10 at night, buttered and warm and imperfect. And I thought about calendars and squares and how my mother used to write the numbers down so she could watch them coming. I've got the numbers now. Every one of them balances. And I put the kettle on and stirred my own tea with a spoon, not a stick, and listened to it click once against the cup. And I was, at last, in the smallest and truest sense of the word, grateful.